Welcome to California Frontier, the show about the often overlooked and unexpected early history of the place we call California. I'm your host, Damian Basic. Welcome to part 2 of my interview with archaeologist Dr. Rubén Mendoza. Now, if you haven't listened to part 1, I recommend you go back and do so. And in that episode, Rubén talks about his life growing up in the Central Valley of California and being awakened to an interest in archaeology and art history by a visit to Mission San Juan Bautista when he was in 4th grade. Later, he continued on to do doctoral studies in archaeology, and he talks about how he began to investigate this phenomenon of the solar geometry of the missions. Now, in this episode, we're going to go into more depth about what he discovered at a number of missions in which these solar illuminations take place, how this knowledge was actually lost, why we don't know about this anymore, and the fierce opposition he received when he publicized his findings. So without further ado, the second half of my interview with Dr. Rubén Mendoza. You know, I knew that traditionally churches are built or have been built on an east-west axis, right? Because you would be facing the east where Christ would be coming, at the end of time, would be returning. It's really interesting, though, to hear that, for example, in the case of San Juan Bautista, not only was that happening, but it was oriented toward this cleft in the hills that the sun was rising through. So I guess, one question I have is, what kind of tools were they using? How were they making those calculations? And secondly, what you're implying or what you're suggesting is that there was sort of an understanding with the indigenous people there that these are certain spots that are significant for us, and that would be important to highlight them in a ritual way. Does that make sense? Am I on the right track?
Yes, no, you're on the right track, and that is a part of the tack that I take, because I see no point in being divisive about these issues. These are discoveries. These are part of the human tradition. They are part of the science, technology, and medicines, and the sophistication of our ancestors, indigenous and otherwise. And to assert or to claim, it's like European colonists claiming one continent over another, disregarding the existing inhabitants. So that's what's happening. People want to claim it for their tradition and use it to despise the other tradition. I don't buy into that. Again, I don't take sides when it comes to my ancestors. They both contributed. The friars clearly had an objective to acknowledge the coming of the Christ through the light of the Christ. In Mexico, in the Sierra de Puebla, the Nahua speakers of the eastern contingent of the Nahua tradition, they continue to do a midsummer solstice pilgrimage to the top of a hill. And they do sacrifices of animals, flowers, and other things all the way up to the top. And they say that the light of the Christ is at the summit. So they're doing it under the guise of Catholicism. And it's appropriate to the church and its founders. So they do this ceremony, but as a midsummer solstice, they get to the top, and what's there? A massive cross painted white, which for them represents the illumination of the sun. And they see Christ as the Cristo Helios, the solar Christ. And that's part of a very ancient tradition in the Americas. So much so that the sunburst monstrance that we know of, this was a device that holds the Eucharist, the host, and it typically was circular. It would have a crystal, and then the Eucharist would be placed and would be used for processions or for the altars. Well, in the Americas, the church modified this to include the sunburst. So the church was actively engaged in conflating a Jesus with the sun, and thereby reconciling indigenous traditions of solar worship with that of Christ and literally making them one and the same. So the Cristo Helios is very much a part of the Spanish colonial and indigenous traditions of the Americas. So when we look at these churches, San Juan has a multitude of elements that make it even more significant as an archetype of the heavenly kingdom, the New Jerusalem, and all of these other things that the friars were very much invested in. In fact, if I were to take kind of a stripped down version of the church at San Juan, think of it this way: you come to the face of the church, and it's a massive whitewashed facade which is devoid and sterile in terms of iconography, and it has three arches as you're approaching. The three arches from Roman antiquity represent the propylaeum, the gateway to heaven or the kingdom. So you're approaching the kingdom, but on the exterior, what you have is something that alludes back to the Middle East and the traditions of how the world was seen as a place that was devoid of a spiritual dimension. So the facade of the church is devoid of anything that speaks to that which is sacred. But you pass through the gateway of the propylaeum, you enter the church, and suddenly you're confronted by a spectacle, a theater of conversion, a theater of light, in which you see vines, you see flowers, you see all these very elaborate elements, you see the saints, and in the case of San Juan, you have three aisles. So, again, the Trinity, and then you have 12 archways. Again, you're looking at the gateways to the heavenly kingdom, as well as the number 12 reflecting the apostles and many other dimensions. And then when you take it all into account, as you pass towards the altar, you're passing by each one of 14 stations of the cross, which was literally the pathway of the Christ during the crucifixion. You get to the altar and you have eight portals or nichos with various saints, and each of those saints relate to agriculture, they relate to the sun, the founders of the church, and so forth, including the Santo Niño. So all of the iconography, and if you look at the altar at San Juan, it has these green columns. There's a total of 12 of them. If you go back to the Solomonic columns of the great temple, the heavenly kingdom
in Jerusalem,
King Solomon's temple, you have the 12 columns, you have the 12 portals, and ultimately the indication for me, if you include the blue doors to the exterior of the church, you have literally the river of life, which is alluded to in the book of Revelation as representing the roaring and the ushering in of the waters that bring the Christ. And so when you look at it as this dynamic, animated being, because many indigenous communities saw buildings like those of the ancestral Pueblo as living beings that needed to be fed. And so for me, through my indigenous understandings and background, I see these temples, even though some might see this as heresy, as embodiments of the spiritual and cosmological dimensions of the church. And if you think about it, when I sit in that church, I don't see this sterile building. I'm literally surrounded by the book of Revelation, by the heavenly kingdom, all of the various dimensions that you see in Jerusalem are literally embodied in that building. And then, to top it off, the building is oriented to the east, and on the midwinter solstice, the day most dreaded by the indigenous communities of the Mutsun and other Ohlone communities, you have the sun break through the saddle and send the light of the Christ into the church. And within about 20-minute span, it literally centers on the tabernacle, and the light of Christ literally illuminates the body and blood of Christ. What's interesting about all this is that having observed the illumination on the midwinter solstice, there was one year where the Los Angeles Times was tracking my work, and they wanted, where's the next illumination? Can you be at Carmel when that illumination happens on the midsummer solstice? And I, which would have been June 21st. And I said, I'm going to be out of state that time, but the next one would be San Jose. And then the one after that is Mission San Juan Bautista. So the reporter showed up at the San Juan Bautista illumination on December 21st, and the church was packed with people. And he was busy taking photos, taking notes, interviewing people. And I was asked to explain what the community was about to see. I did a brief presentation, but one woman that was in the audience walked up to me and she says, "Why does the sun hit those boards with no iconography? Why does it hit that? There's nothing there." And then it dawned on me, Father Ed's got the wrong date. So I thought, wow, all of this is built up around the midwinter solstice. So I thought about it and I did a calculation using tables that I developed on the trajectory of the sun. And I realized that the illumination that would first strike one of the saints, mainly Saint Francis, who was originally situated in the lower left, that would happen on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception on December 12th, or December 8th, excuse me. And then I projected from that forward into January, and it turned out that the illumination would return on January 6th, which is Epiphany, which is the date traditionally ascribed in Latin America to Christmas. And so I waited until December 6th. I went into the church with a high-end camera and several other still cameras. And as I was preparing and narrating what was about to happen, suddenly the light begins to pulsate through the window and it illuminates St. Isidore, who now stands where the original St. Francis once stood. And it framed it perfectly. I managed to get a lot of photos of that. And then the light dropped and it illuminated the tabernacle. And through the course of the day at noon, the clerestory windows began illuminating St. John the Baptist at precisely noon. And then through the course of the next hour and a half, the side altar, which is on the far east end of the church, which once held the nativity, a beam of light comes in and illuminates that nativity scene, which is now dominated by the Santo Niño de Atocha. And then I watched and documented as various clerestory windows illuminated the Stations of the Cross on the east half of the church. So for me, it was it was a miraculous apparition of the faith.
It almost seems like at a certain point, let's back up. It seems like at one point this was all understood, certainly in the early years when the mission was founded, and then somehow it got lost. And then because by the fact that you're mentioning, that certain statues had been moved and images had been moved around, so that they probably wouldn't have done that had they been aware of this phenomenon. So why do you think it was lost? And let's start with that. And then I have a question about the other missions, much of which have been restored, and how does that work with those that perhaps aren't, in the same architectural orientation or style or what have you. But let's start with why do you think it was lost?
Well, the church underwent significant upheaval, especially in the Americas. You've got competing claims to indigeneity, Hispanic identity, and each of these, were not reconciled easily. Even though in the Spanish colonial period, you actually have a conflation and a reconciliation that is destroyed during the course of the wars to free the Mexicans, for example, or the Argentinians and others from the yoke of Spanish oppression, as it was characterized. The church was very powerful in the Spanish colonial era, and it often had ties, obviously, to the military and the government. And with the Franciscans, they really didn't have a lot of choice. They went along with what they had to in order to avoid the fate of the Jesuits who were expelled. I think that was one factor. But as through the course of that period from 1810 all the way through 1821, many of the missionaries began to break away. Those who were loyal to Spain were basically told to leave. And then you brought in Zacatecan friars and others. And that's not to say they didn't have similar identifications with the iconography or the cosmology. But I think let's put it this way. At one point, I was told, and by a person of indigenous background who's prominent in the missions, he basically said, this is heresy. Father Serra would never have permitted this. It's primitivism. And I disagreed. And I continue to disagree, because their argument was the tabernacle would not have held the host because the Indians had not been baptized or not fully baptized into the church. And yet the symbolism of that, even in churches that are bereft of much of the indigenous community, also practice the tradition of placing the Eucharist into the tabernacle. So I see that as a spurious argument. But with all of these conflicting traditions, conflicting ideologies, and then, of course, the suppression of the church in the 19th century, I believe that a lot of this went to the background. Now you are a friar, but you are being converted over to basically the secular church. This is now a secular setting. You're not to promulgate some of these identities that go back to the earliest church. You're here to teach the gospel for those that care to hear it. And of course, there were many who sought the dismantling of the church altogether. And secularization caused the ruination and the destruction of much of the tradition that had been left behind. Fortunately, we have settings like the Santa Barbara Mission Archives, personal collectors who have come forth with their books and documents to reassemble that history. And then we have the 250,000 or so documents that are presently in Mexico City and the Archivo General de la Nación, the National Archives, and I've been there on several occasions. And many of those documents, that 250,000 figure was one that was cited by Gerald Jackman out of Santa Barbara, who said there's at least 250,000 just for the 60 or so year period of the California missions. So we're nowhere near having scratched the surface as to what was known, what was lost, and what could be known if we had more people invested like yourself in being able to interpret, transcribe, interpret, and translate these documents for a broader scholarly community. And I know you've done a lot of that kind of work, and you are the kind of people we need on the ground to do this kind of work. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of people out there. You know, Rosemary Beebe, Robert Senkowitz are among those who have really brought things to the fore with their translations that are more accurate renditions of period literatures and writings by people like Serra and his compatriots. And until that's done, I think that much of the mission tradition will remain very mysterious. And if you go to the Santa Barbara Mission Archives, there was a period where I was not allowed to go in there because of my research. And there just happened to be an archivist there that didn't buy into it. And so I wasn't allowed. And friends, like Rosemary Beebe and Robert Senkowitz would say, "Oh, Rubén, you need to get into those." I said, "I know I do, but I've actually been stopped at the door." Well, finally, the administrator there heard about my plight. He said, "Rubén, I would like you to come out here. I have some science books I need to show you." And so he took me into we walked right past the gentleman that didn't want me to go in there. And we went over to the science section, and there were books in math and astronomy and everything else. And he pulled two books out. And one of them was a treatise that had been done on the Metonic calendar, El Calendario Metónico. And I opened it up, and what I found, and I've since published a very brief essay about that book in a volume that was published by the Santa Barbara Mission Archives. And that article, I was able to reproduce some of the tables spanning thousands of years of lunar observations into the past and actually into the future. So these volumes were available to the missionaries throughout the Americas to calibrate that calendar. And in that treatise, I found a section on how to use the summer solstice and winter solstice and equinox to calibrate Holy Week. So it's clear to me that this was part of a science. And according to the administrator who took me in there, he sent me a packet of material showing that the Vatican's own observatory continues to calibrate these numbers.
What you're saying is that there were manuals that were available at the time
Yes.
to be able to track all of these things. And you've mentioned this word metonic calendar a couple of times. Could you define that?
Yes. Meton was essentially a Greek scientist, if you will, who came to the conclusion that the metonic calendar, lunisolar calendar, if you observe the moon, if you were able to do it with the sharpest eye, you still would not be able to see the variations from year to year. But the calibration of the equinox and the passage of the sun through the course of a solar year varies slightly from that of the moon. The moon has a 18.9 year cycle. And so, in other words, for example, taking this image of you, let's assume that that image or box that you're framed in is the illumination, and it's happening on December 21st at 7:15 a.m. Well, each year there's going to be a slight variation where literally once the trajectory at 45 degrees hits that spot, it's going to be slightly offset over the course of a nearly 19-year cycle. But you won't see it until you're closer to the far end of that. And then you'll notice, oh, wait a minute. And I've seen this in my photography. What's stationary here in a few years, maybe 10 years, you'll actually see that the light has dropped just below its original setting, its founding date. I saw this at Mission San Miguel when I made the discoveries there. And I was looking for, in that particular case, we found a calibration of each saint on the altar is illuminated in 5-year spans. And at the end of the span, it illuminates San Antonio de Padua. And right above San Antonio, you have the stigmata with the 5 wounds of Christ. So there's a correlation between the iconography and the spirituality and the illuminations and their succession. The first illumination occurs in that church. You have an illumination of the side of the church where the light finally hits the interior of the church, but within 5 days, it hits the lower left niche or nicho that has St. Francis of Assisi. So literally, it's like a call out to the founder of the Franciscan order. And then it follows. The next illumination then strikes the patron saint, San Miguel, and it illuminates it perfectly. And then the tabernacle, 5 days after that, and 5 days after that, it illuminates, San Antonio de Padua with the apparition of the Christ child and the stigmata right above him. What happens, though, is that happens through the course of I call it equinoctial, because it doesn't happen exactly. We're looking at October 4th by this point, or 3rd. But then it reappears right after the vernal equinox, and then it reverses its trajectory. And so the illuminations span the period of Holy Week. And so if I were to go back to that initial reading, one could argue that, and actually I did do this on a kind of hypothetical basis. I was trying to determine, okay, was this intentional for the founding and orientation of the original church? And what I found is if we go by the equinoctial calendar, the first illumination on that tabernacle that is set where it was originally would have been perfect. But through the course of time, there's an offset that occurs through the course of the 19-year cycle. And so if a person goes in there 5 years later, they're going, oh, Mendoza's full of it. This thing doesn't produce the perfect image he claims. Well, that's because of the metonic cycle. Meton had used that cycle. The Babylonians used that cycle before him. He gets credit for it. And then the Jews adopted it. And I would contend that the ancient Maya of Mesoamerica used the metonic calendar because it's understood, but they don't identify it as that. They were using that 19-year cycle to calibrate one of the most accurate calendars ever produced in antiquity. And so we could say the indigenous peoples of the America had already pioneered this. It occurred in Europe. And of course, it had been around for a long time. But it is a way to correct the calendar. That's why we have the leap year. We have not been able to correct it in a utilitarian fashion. just like we haven't fixed the issue of daylight savings time. There's all kinds of calibrations that need to be done, and most of us don't have time, even if we have some sort of a smartwatch to figure out those calculations. We go to work, we do our 365 days and a quarter, and then we assume, we've done our time, and everything's going to happen in a precise cycle. Well, it doesn't. There are too many wheels in the cosmos to correlate it all, except at singular points in time, as did the ancient Maya.
So, how many of the current California missions, as they are, still reflect this architecture and go through these sort of phenomena every year? Okay.
Well, one of the problems, and I've faced this at Mission San Jose for years. The administrator there, a former administrator, would not let me into the church until someone advocated for my research. And then that individual was with me when we saw the illumination in the church, and she was astounded. She said, in all the years I've been here, I'd never heard of this. And, I got it on tape. I photographed it. And so that was a mission that I literally would go to that mission every year about right around the Feast of St. Francis. And every time I'd miss it, except on the last time, I was staring through the keyhole in the front door, and I'm literally watching as the sun is moving in a trajectory from, and bear in mind that church faces to the west. And so otherwise it reverses things, and the light comes in through the window and strikes the back of the church and moves towards the front of the church instead of starting at the altar. So it moves to the upper right, and it intersects the tabernacle perfectly. And that church, my detractors would say, oh, well, that's a rebuilt church. Well, Sir Richard Joseph Menn was the individual who studied that church and all of the documentation and was instrumental in its rebuilding on the original foundations. And he followed through with reconstructing the altarpiece, the paintings, all of that as precisely as he could. So knowing his work, I would say that it reflects on that cyclicity, if you will, of the illumination. To get back to your question, I would contend, and I came to this conclusion in 2004 in time for the CMF, the California Mission Studies Conference in San Luis Obispo. Unfortunately, when I went in to give my presentation with all these slides I produced over a 2-week period of driving from mission to mission from the north to the south in time for that event, they held the event in a gymnasium that had, there was too much sunlight. And so you couldn't make out any of the images. But at that time, I proposed that there were 14 California missions whose orientations fit the bill, including the foundations and the remaining adobe of the destroyed mission church at La Purísima Concepción. That one is a equinoctial mission, and based on what's left of the doorway, I was able to calculate that would have been a Feast of St. Francis illumination. But because it's equinoctial, it'll happen twice a year. And so you'll see it on St. Francis' birthday, and then in some cases on the founding of those churches. And so 14 churches. The problem is in a number of those, for example, Mission Santa Clara, some years ago, they actually blocked half of the window because of the light striking the priest, especially after, because the priest would face towards the altar when they did their homilies. That was the original tradition. And then, of course, after Vatican II, I guess it is, you had them turn around and face the parishioners. Well, that became a problem. And for some, they actually sealed those windows, ironically, not realizing what they represented. In the case of San Miguel, I took all of my camera equipment, placed it outside the church, but out of respect, because I realized the church is about to conduct its service, I left my camera equipment outside with the camera running on the horizon to capture the rise of the sun. I went into the church and I literally saw the illumination of the altar and thought, I don't have my cameras. And the priest, the parishioners that went up, the choral group, they were singing and they had to cover their faces as the sun was striking them. And I was so taken by what I saw, I went up to the pastor and I said, Father, this illumination of the altar, how often does this happen? He said, oh, it happens about twice a year. And it, he kind of implied it was a nuisance. And then he said, yeah, it's daylight savings time. And I said, no, Father, it's the feast of St. Francis. And he goes, oh, no, daylight savings time. And then I had the same experience with a Franciscan at Mission Espada in San Antonio, Texas. A ranger there was absolutely determined to get me over to Espada Church. And we arrived in the evening, and we get there because he wanted me to talk to the friars there. And we get there, and they're not available. There's nobody there. And I thought, wow, I'm going to be heading back to California tomorrow. I'm not going to get this. So I took a measurement of the orientation of the building and realized this is a Feast of St. Francis orientation to the building. And just as we were about to leave, this big SUV, a black SUV with lifted tires and American flag pulls up. And I thought, oh man, I'm going to have problems with this guy. They're going to see a Mexican and they're regardless of what I am to anybody else. And this bald-headed, this very tall gentleman whose head was shaved, he's wearing a blue jumpsuit with American flags on it. And I thought he's probably a militia member. It turns out he's the friar there in charge. And I asked him, what's with the uniform? He says, I've been wearing this since 9/11 to show my patriotism. And then we got past that, and I said, does the light enter the church here? And he goes, yes, it happens twice a year. And he says, a brother Larry, I forget the name of the friar he mentioned, he says he's taken to wearing Ray-Bans because he can't do the homily because the light's hitting him straight in the face while he stands at the altar. And so I realized, okay, we've got a convergence of utility, practicality, and that which is sacred. And the missions at, for example, San Juan Bautista, as I've articulated, is a midwinter solstice. Shortly thereafter, I discovered the illumination at Mission San Carlos Borromeo, Carmel. That's a midsummer solstice, but each of these sites has two illuminations. One that is astronomically significant, and the other is liturgically significant. So Corpus Christi at Carmel is one of the illuminations straight on the tabernacle, but also the midsummer solstice is the other, which I first discovered. At San Juan Bautista, you have the midwinter solstice, and then you, of course, have the Epiphany illumination. And the tertiary illumination is the Immaculate Conception. So you have San Juan Bautista, you have Carmel, you have San Miguel, and I would also contend that each of the archangels, in other words, San Miguel, San Gabriel, and San Rafael, they're all oriented identically. And the illuminations occur in each of those churches, except that in the case of San Rafael, that church was demolished. And we only have illustrations of the Mudéjar window like that at Carmel that would have been the source of the illumination. We have other sites. For example, San Luis Rey de Francia is a south-oriented church. And I've been asked this question repeatedly. What about our church? It's oriented to the south. In the case of San Juan Capistrano, they had lanterns in the cupula or the domes that once covered that church. I believe there were 6 to 7 of these domes, and there were lanterns, as is the case at San Luis Rey de Francia. And I happened to be in that church in one of the areas off to the side aisle in a California Missions Foundation meeting when, as I was sitting there looking through the window, I literally saw a spear of light strike the tabernacle. And I thought, what is this? And I rushed out of the meeting and I photographed it. And you have 3 spears of light coming from the lantern, striking literally the tabernacle, almost as though they were the spears of destiny. And that happens in tandem with the illuminations at Mission Santa Ynez, which again fall in February. And I found that out from the janitorial crew, who are always in the church first. And so there's a host of missions where these illuminations occur. And in the churches to the south, I would contend those are likely also should be included in that number 14, because they, in those that had lanterns, similar illuminations would happen, as was the case at the mission at Jalpan, which Father Serra built in Querétaro, where I actually observed the illumination right near the midsummer solstice, in which the baptistry is illuminated through a mudahar window, and then you have successive illuminations of each of the saints in the altar through the lantern in a church oriented to the south, and identically with that at Carmel and that at Santa Clara, which I contend is also a solstice church.
Is there, I know I've read a number of your articles. Where would you recommend people, or what would you recommend people read regarding this that you've written, if they want to go more in depth or kind of, if they haven't taken good notes on our conversation?
Well, I do have a website called solsticechronicles.org. It's not very well designed. In fact, the only time I got feedback was when someone complained that the lettering was too small for her to read and that I needed to change the graphics. And I thought, well, I did this out of my own pocket. And so I haven't altered that site at all. And I did endeavor to post several of my articles there. I do have some images. And then a couple of the videos have become unlinked, but solsticechronicles.org. Okay. And then my latest publication is in this book. It's titled, the book is titled, and I have a chapter in here. I was contacted by the publishers who were working on medieval churches, and they wanted something on the late medieval period. And the book is called Natural Light in Medieval Churches, edited by Vladimir Ivanovici and Alice Isabel Sullivan. And it's published by Brill. And I'll be frank, this is one of those academic texts that is a little bit pricey. Otherwise, I would have ordered more copies myself. And I have a chapter in here that I know this is probably hard to see, but I'll just read it to you. Let's see. It's chapter 12, the last chapter, Canticle of the Sun, Archaeastronomy and Solar Eucharistic Worship in the Millennial New World. And this is where I'd be happy to send you a copy, electronic copy. So if you have, some of your viewers, I don't know if I want to put this on you, but if you have some of your viewers that would like to get into the mechanics, that's the most extensive article that I've ever written on the topic. I was holding out using the manuscript for a book, but I was contacted by these people, and the manuscript I had submitted as part of an archaeology session. It was supposed to have been published back in 2012, and the editor failed to get a publisher. He claimed it was politics. And he also didn't like the fact that all my footnotes are very detailed about the liturgical dimensions of each of these illuminations. He said, oh, no, let's take that all out. And I refused to let him do that. I said, it's meaningless without the liturgy. But I do have an electronic version of that I can send out to you, and then we can go from there.
Okay, yeah, let's do that, and then we can decide what's the best way for people who want access to it to.
Yeah, this article, I break down the solar or the midsummer solstice or the solstice missions from the equinox missions, and then I distinguish those in the Californias in the Southwest from those in Mexico and Latin America. And I would contend that there are tens of thousands of these churches out there. The problem is that, for example, the Metropolitan Cathedral in Mexico City, there are illuminations of the side altars on the feast day of that church, which is in August. And I happened to catch it in I guess it was March while I was there for an archaeology conference at the Templo Mayor. I went into the church, and the illuminations, there are multiple windows. There are about 8 windows, and they were illuminating the bultos, or the saints, in each of the side altars. And then it repeats itself with because it's a south-oriented church, it repeats itself with the other windows for the saints in the other side of the church, on the east side of the church. So that is the largest, I guess I could call it a cosmic archetype of the illuminations related to the saints in any given church in the Americas.
Wow, that's incredible. I've been to that cathedral, but have obviously had no idea about that. And so now I'm really, I really want to read your article. So I'm looking forward to that. What's what projects, or what's the big project that you're working on now? I know you've always got something interesting in the works.
Yeah. Well, I just, as you've already noted, I just finished a project that took years. It was years in the making, and is on ritual human sacrifice in Mesoamerica. And there I'm also dealing with the cosmology of sacrifice, the antiquity of sacrifice. And I have another article, the Rutledge Handbook of Violence in the Ancient Americas, requested a manuscript that deals with what I refer to as war cult caches of the Central Highland Olaman. These were a people that emerged in tandem with the collapse of Teotihuacan. And there's some pretty horrific things going on. But that, I just was notified they're sending me the edits, the final edits, so that will be coming out soon. I met with publishers in New Orleans a couple of weeks ago, where I gave a talk on hood archaeologies, because I grew up in the hood, and I was invited to present on how my experiences there translated into the kinds of archaeology that I do. And of course, I look at ritual violence. Well, I grew up around something other than ritual violence, and I've always tried to understand groups like the Aztecs. So that article, that book is likely to come out soon, because one of our colleagues, Alberto Gonzalez, who's at East Bay, he's the one that kind of led the charge on that, and he and his co-editor have worked up a prospectus. Publisher has already been identified with. Literally, he was approached even before our session. My presentation was a bit graphic, because let's just say my lifestyle, or at least my early years, I was surrounded by violence and all kinds of problems. And I was studying the Aztecs. So, it was like, oh, this is normal. I never connected the violence around me or the violence of the Aztecs to anything tangible. I accepted it, but at the same time, I've always construed myself a pacifist. But I also know when you or your loved ones are threatened, then violence sometimes is the only other recourse. And then to answer your question, I met with two publishers, one of whom is really quite excited about a manuscript that a colleague and I are looking at. Jennifer Lucido, you may know from the conference. We've collaborated on a host of manuscripts. She is truly brilliant. She's a nerd just like me, and we spend a lot of time focusing on these questions. She's since published with the Russian Academy of Sciences, on the Afro-Mestizo presence in the Anza expedition, and how that translated into the early Afro-Mestizo presence in Monterey and San Francisco. And so one of the projects that I actually proposed back in 2016 was something that deals with fake news in California mission studies. As you might understand, that fake news became popular. But when I approached the editor, Jennifer and I sat down with the editor. I was going to be dealing with the Neo-Mexica experience. I was a Neo-Mexica, believing I was an Aztec descendant. When I was in my early high school and college years, I'd pray in Nahuatl. I was so determined to be Aztec, and without seeing the violence of that tradition. I fully see it now. But anyway, the prospectus that we presented was about something called agnotology, which is the fabrication of facts to political ends by the tobacco companies. And the professor at Stanford who's pushing this area, I was intrigued by that, because I've been confronted by these fabrications in mission studies for years. People, going on about, how brutal Father Serra was. Well, that's an open question, but I have yet to find documentation that paints him in that way. In fact, Rosemary Beebe and Robert Senkowitz clearly found a very different person in him. If he's being blamed for having established the missions, that's one thing. But to be reviled as a genocidal maniac is really a fabrication. And so the book that we're putting together is going to address these. And one of the things I plan to do is to develop a section of the book that has two personalities from this early California history. Father Serra facing off against Leland Stanford to determine which of the two, if you took a checklist, was in fact engaged in genocide. And I can assure you it wasn't Father Serra. And yet Stanford has taken to erasing his name, according to them, in order to honor their Native American students. And when I was interviewed by one of the reporters about this erasure, I told them right from the outset, you're not going to like what I have to say. And she go, oh, no, we're fair and balanced, kind of like Fox News. And so I told them, I said, if you truly want to honor your Native American students, you will recruit and fund more of them to get into your university with your substantial endowment, and you will recruit more Native Californian and other American Indian archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians, and retain them and tenure them at Stanford University, which is not the practice at the moment. And then the second part of that was, and I said, again, you're not going to publish what I have to say. I said, why are you erasing Serra's name when it's clear that Leland Stanford, as governor of California, was directly engaged in sending out an Indian militia to eradicate Native Californians for lands that he and his colleagues coveted? And so, to make a long story short, the book will address some of these dimensions, including some of what Jack Williams pioneered in terms of some of the outright fabrications about the Native California and California mission experience. It's not going to make us a lot of friends, and I've actually suggested to Jennifer Lucido she might want to reconsider publishing with me. But I want to lay it out, and I want to give those who acquire the book, because the publisher has been writing me. They want this. I want to make sure that I'm not trying to push my perspectives, but I want to present the facts and then let them interrogate the facts, as I do with my students, and provide counterpoints based on fact. The problem is I don't tend to get facts back when I'm attacked over particular perspectives. The second book, let's just say an international press out of London wants to publish the work I did in my graduate school years on Chicano street gangs, counterculture, lowriders, street art, and so forth. And they're willing to publish hundreds of my images in the volume. I've already done a number of manuscripts that have been sitting around for years because every time I would publish in graduate school, there were detractors who came after me, including my own professors. So let's just say between my experience with lowriders who were characterized as punks and hoods by the Mexican community, to my work with Serra and the missions, who are characterized as genocidal maniacs, it seems like I'm never going to get a break whenever I take on these topics from history. So my attitude now is I'm just going to take them on and let the chips fall where they may.
Well, I want to read both of those. I hope I'll find out when they come out because, yeah, they sound really interesting, really fascinating. And I'd like the way that your life puts those topics together, and your life, but also your scholarship, which I think is a very quintessential California story. I think yours is. And I think the work that you're doing is a continual gift and huge resource to people who care about the complexity of the past and also the connection that it has to our present. And, one of the things that for me, I think is really important in studying history is understanding that it's not a tale of good guys versus bad guys.
Yes, exactly.
There are individuals and there are movements.
Yes.
And even those individuals are different as time goes by as well. If you take a snapshot of my life when I was 18 and now when I'm in my 50s, we're the same person, but we're also very different at the same time.
Yes.
So I really appreciate that. And yeah, like I said, I'm looking forward to reading more and there's, and your bibliography is huge. So there's a lot for all of us to read and to learn from. So yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Rubén Mendoza. And I am looking forward to hopefully having you back on more often in the future, if you're up for that.
Yeah, I'd love to. I'd like to speak to the archaeology. I've worked in a number of California missions. The archaeology I've done in the Amerindian community in Colorado, Arizona, Mexico. These are all stories that are a direct byproduct of the findings we've made. And I've endeavored to publish what I could, but the stories don't often get beyond the academy, and I'd like to see more of that. So
yeah.
And your show makes that possible for those of us that might be construed as nerds to, kind of nerdify it and make it maybe a little less nerdy and put it out there for a more general public.
Exactly. So we're on the same page. Well, thank you again, Rubén, and hopefully we'll do this again soon.
Okay. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the California Frontier Show. If you'd like to support the show, the best thing to do is to let